If the draft turns wrong, this mountain becomes my son's tomb.
October of 1861 arrived early in the upper Bitterroot Valley. The wind coming down from the eastern ridges already carried the sharp bite of mountain winter, and the grass along the slopes had turned a dull yellow. The color that meant frost was no longer a warning. It was a sentence already passed. Becket Pruitt stood silently on the barren hillside with one hand holding on to his 8-year-old son, Corey. Ahead of them yawned a black basalt cave carved deep into the mountainside. Behind them along the narrow wagon trail sat Croft Alcott, the older brother of Beckett's late wife, gripping the reins with a face colder than the mountain wind itself. Runipam sat Tilda Alcott, her eyes carefully aimed at the floorboards of the wagon. Not at Becket, not at the boy, not at the dark hollow in the rock that was supposed to pass for shelter. Croft reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He did not hand it over. He dropped it. The deed landed in the mud at Beckett's feet, and Croft watched it fall the way a man watches something he no longer needs. This strip of hillside, he said, his voice rough with contempt. This cracked stretch of black rock in that hole in the mountain. That was your wife's inheritance from her folks. I am giving it back to you. It was not generosity. Every man standing on that hillside understood what it was. It was a way of killing a man and his child without laying a hand on either one of them. The cave behind Becket was the kind of place travelers used long enough to wait out a sudden rainstorm. Nobody had ever wintered inside one. Nobody sane had ever tried. You are sending a child up here to die before the first heavy snow even falls, Becket said quietly. There was no anger left in his voice, only exhaustion, and beneath it something older and heavier than anger. Croft exploded then. Years of buried hatred finally broke loose, and the words came out jagged and fast, the way a man speaks when he has been holding something back for so long that holding it has become its own kind of suffering. You let my sister freeze to death in that rotten timber shack, Croft said. You built her a house that could not keep out the cold, and you called it a home. I watched her die slow, Becket. I watched it happen all winter long, and you stood there feeding that fire like more wood was going to change something. The one sending people to die was always you. He snapped the reins sharply. The wagon turned back toward the valley without a single glance behind. Tilda kept her face down the whole time. Corey pressed himself tightly against Beckett's coat, both hands buried deep in the rough wool fabric, and the old brown hunting dog Scout moved slowly around the cave entrance, sniffing the cold air drifting out from the darkness beyond. Becket did not watch the wagon disappear down the trail. He stood still on the hillside and let the words settle where they had landed. The thing that had eaten at him since the day they buried Wren was not that Croft hated him. The thing that had eaten at him was that he could not say Croft was wrong, not entirely. He had built that cabin with his own hands. He had fed that fire every night through the worst cold Montana territory could deliver. He had done everything a man was supposed to do, and his wife had still died coughing beneath 2 quilts while frost spread slowly across the floorboards beside their bed. He had not understood why the timber walls bled heat no matter how much wood he burned. He had not understood why the warmth never stayed once the flames settled down. He had not understood the thing he was fighting, and not understanding it had cost him the only person who mattered. That was a kind of failure no church could take confession for. He stood on that hillside for a long moment looking at nothing, and then he picked up the deed from the mud, folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. Behind him, Corey had not let go of his sleeve. Pa, the boy asked softly, his voice trembling. We really going to live here? Becket looked at the black mouth of the cave. He looked at the wind bending the dead grass along the slope. Then he picked up the torch he had brought from the wagon and walked toward the darkness. Come on, he said. Inside the darkness thickened fast, but the cold did not. That was the first thing Becket noticed, and it stopped him mid-step. Outside, the October wind cut through wool and skin alike. Inside, the air sat still and heavy and dry in a way that had nothing to do with a fire, because there was no fire. There was nothing in this cave except rock and shadow, and yet the cold had not followed them in. Scout circled once on the basalt floor, then lowered himself onto the stone and settled without shaking. Becket crouched and pressed his palm flat against the rock. Not warm, but not winter cold either. Something between. Something that felt almost deliberate. He lifted the torch slightly and studied the eastern wall. Along a narrow crack in the basalt, the smoke from the torch was moving sideways instead of drifting back into the cave. It bent along the wall, followed the crack, and vanished into the darkness somewhere deeper in the mountain. The rock was pulling air through itself. The mountain was breathing. Basalt was not like timber. Beckett understood timber. He had grown up working with it, cutting it, building with it. Timber was fast. It took heat quickly and gave it back just as quickly, and what it gave back was never quite enough, because timber was thin and full of gaps, and the wind always found the gaps. Basalt was different in every way. It was dense and ancient and slow. The kind of rock formed when entire mountains had once been fire. It absorbed heat the way dry ground absorbed rain, gradually, completely, and it held what it absorbed long after the source was gone. A fire burned inside basalt walls was not just heating air, it was loading stone. And stone released what it had stored slowly, steadily, through the night, through the cold, long after the flames had died down to nothing. If the airflow through that eastern crack could be shaped and directed rather than left to chance, this cave was not a hole in a mountain. It was a vessel. It was something that could be made to hold warmth the way a clay pot held water. 10 minutes later, Corey had sat down against the eastern wall. 5 minutes after that, the boy was asleep. Beckett looked at his son, then at the black walls surrounding them. And for the first time since the morning they lowered Wren into the frozen ground, a thought entered his mind that he had not allowed himself before. Not hope exactly. Something more dangerous than hope. A question. Whether the man who had failed to understand timber walls was capable of understanding something harder, older and far less forgiving. He did not know the answer, but he was cold, and his son was asleep, and the mountain was breathing, and there was nowhere else to go. 2 days later, Beckett rode down into Bitterroot Crossing to trade for lamp oil and salt before the first heavy frost sealed the upper roads. The general store sat at the center of the settlement, the way all general stores did in valley towns, equal parts supply depot and courtroom, the place where a man's standing was measured every time he walked through the door. Inez Brecken was behind the counter when Beckett came in. She was a compact and deliberate woman in her late 50s, a widow who had outlasted 3 husbands and 2 business partners, and who controlled most of the valley's winter credit ledger through a combination of sharp arithmetic and long memory. She watched Beckett cross the floor the way a woman watches a horse she has already decided not to buy. "A cave is fine enough for a bear come snow season," she said. Her voice carried the easy authority of someone who did not need to raise it to be heard. Never heard of one fit for raising a boy. Nobody laughed out loud. That made it worse. A spoon stopped halfway to a man's mouth near the wood stove. Somebody shifted boots against the floorboards. Eyes followed Beckett without staying on him long enough to feel impolite. The room did not turn against him. It simply turned away from him, which was a quieter kind of rejection and harder to argue with. Beckett understood what Inez Brecken actually was in that moment, and it was not simply a cruel woman. She had buried 2 neighbors in the past 3 winters because of decisions that seemed reasonable in September and proved fatal by January. She had watched families stake their survival on shelters and plans that men with more confidence than knowledge had declared sufficient. In her mind, she was offering Beckett a service. She was naming the odds before he wasted too much time pretending they did not exist. That did not make it easier to stand there and say nothing. He bought 2 coils of rough rope and an old stone pick with the handle worn smooth from another man's hands, and he paid without comment. At the back of the store, Pastor Elmo Thayer watched the exchange quietly from beneath the brim of his black hat, his expression unreadable, his coffee untouched. Outside, Corey climbed back up onto the wagon seat beside his father. As they pulled away from the hitching rail, 2 boys standing near the post whispered just loud enough to carry. "Cave fool." Beckett kept driving as though the wind had set it. He had 1 stop left before returning to the mountain. Most men in the Bitterroot Valley who needed to understand something about weather or terrain or the particular disposition of the mountains above the basin eventually heard the same name, Hale Patton. Nobody seemed entirely sure how old the man was. He had been described as ancient for as long as anyone in the settlement could remember, which suggested he had simply reached some age past which the word no longer meant anything useful. The trail to Hale's place followed an abandoned trapping route north of the basin, narrow and rough, and easy to lose in poor light. Beckett found the old man splitting cedar beside a low stone shelter that had been built half into the hillside itself, the kind of structure that looked less like something a man had built and more like something the mountain had allowed. Hale had a long gray beard and one bad shoulder that sat lower than the other, and his eyes moved over a man the way experienced hunters read ice on a river crossing, looking not at the surface but at what the surface was telling you about everything underneath. Beckett mentioned the basalt cave. Hale stopped swinging the axe. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he drove the axe head into the splitting stump and left it there. "That cave still breathing?" he asked. Beckett frowned slightly. "Breathing. The mountain pulls air through it," Hale said. "Always did." He led Beckett inside the shelter and spread rough charcoal sketches across a work table that had absorbed years of knife marks and burn circles from careless lantern placement. The drawings showed cross-sections of rock formations, vent shafts, drainage angles, the direction of prevailing canyon winds at different elevations. Hale explained slowly using plain language rather than the vocabulary of engineers or scholars. Airflow mattered more than fire. That was the core of it. A properly designed cave system could trap and radiate warmth through stored mass without burning through a season's worth of timber in 2 months. But the draft had to move correctly, consistently, and in the right direction. Without that, the same quality that made a cave capable of outlasting any timber structure in a mountain winter became its most dangerous feature. "A cave is not a cabin," Hale said. He pointed toward the vent shaft drawn into one of the stone cross-sections. "Cabins leak heat. Caves trap everything. Warmth too. Smoke too. If the draft turns wrong, the mountain keeps the poison with you. Smoke does not kill fast. It lulls a man to sleep in the warmth. That is what makes it the most dangerous thing inside that mountain. Not the cold, not the wind. The smoke." He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the dead spring outside the doorway. And when he spoke again, his voice had the flat, even quality of a lesson repeated enough times to have lost all its drama. "That mountain has no room for pride," he said. "Smoke rolls backward after midnight. Snow seals the upper vent before dawn. You are not careful, the mountain turns that cave into a tomb. Not for you, for the boy." Beckett listened without interrupting while wind scraped against the outer rocks beyond the shelter walls. When Hale finished, the old man did not add anything else. He looked at the sketches on the table and then at Beckett, and his expression held neither encouragement nor doubt. Only the waiting patience of a man who had said what needed saying and understood that the rest was not his to decide. Outside, riding back toward the mountain in the late afternoon light, Beckett turned the warning over in his mind, the way a man turns a stone he has found in a field, looking at every face of it before deciding what it is. What stayed with him was not the technical detail. It was the certainty in Hale's voice, the complete absence of anything performative in it. The old man had not been warning him away from the cave. He had been warning him about a specific and particular way of dying that he understood from somewhere beyond books or theory. Beckett did not know yet from where. But the way Hale had spoken about the smoke, quietly, exactly without drama, sounded like a man who had learned the cost of the lesson before he learned the lesson itself. The next 6 days, Beckett worked from first light until the mountain disappeared into darkness. He cut lodgepole pine along the lower ridge and hauled the trunks uphill one at a time using rope harnesses across his shoulders. His hands blistered on the second day and cracked open on the third, and he kept working. Corey gathered moss and wet clay from the creek bank below the slope, filling every sack and bucket they owned, and carrying them up the switchbacks at a pace that surprised Beckett every time he looked back. The boy was 8 years old and did not complain once. Scout dragged smaller branches alongside them with a line tied loosely around his chest, moving with the slow dignity of an old animal who understood that the work mattered, even if he no longer moved quickly. The cave mouth began changing shape slowly day by day, like a face becoming familiar. First came the drainage trench, cut along the eastern edge, angled carefully to carry meltwater and snowmelt away from the entrance rather than letting it pool inside. Then the double timber throat wall at the cave mouth, narrow enough to trap the heat of the interior against the outer cold, wide enough to allow smoke to travel upward along the vent path if the draft held steady. After the throat wall came the flat shale slabs fitted above the fire pit, positioned to deflect rising heat deeper into the chamber, rather than losing it straight up through the cave roof. On the 6th day, Beckett collected stones from the creek bed below the slope and stacked them in layers behind what he had begun to think of as the bench, a long, flat section of basalt along the eastern wall that sat at roughly seated height. He packed the river stones tight against the basalt, filling gaps with clay, building a thermal mass that could absorb heat from a fire and release it slowly through the night the way a brick oven released warmth into a kitchen long after the bread had been pulled and the coals had gone gray. The evening of the seventh day, he built the first real fire. For several minutes it worked. The throat wall directed the smoke correctly. The shale shelf above the fire pit pushed the heat toward the chamber walls rather than letting it rise and escape. The air in the cave shifted from cool to warm in a way that felt different from the sharp, immediate warmth of an open flame. It felt like the rock itself was beginning to remember what warmth was. Then the wind outside changed. It did not shift gradually. It switched the way a current switches beneath river ice all at once and without warning. Black smoke reversed through the throat wall so suddenly that the change felt intentional, as though the mountain had decided to demonstrate something. Corey woke coughing from the blankets near the basalt bench. Scout barked once and backed away from the darkening air. Beckett smothered the fire with dirt before the smoke could thicken further, working fast, moving low, trying to stay beneath the worst of it. He got the fire out before midnight. He sat in the cold dark afterward with eyes burning badly enough that he could barely make out the cave walls in the fading torchlight. The basalt around him cooled almost immediately once the fire was gone, the stored warmth vanishing faster than he had expected, leaving the air inside barely warmer than the hillside outside. Long after Corey finally stopped coughing and fell back to sleep, Beckett stayed awake in the darkness, listening to the boy breathe. He thought about the rope they had used to haul those pine trunks up the slope. He thought about the clay and moss Corey had carried up the switchbacks for 6 straight days without being asked twice. He thought about Croft dropping that deed in the mud. He thought about Wren saying that the house stayed cold from the floor all upward, saying it quietly, saying it like it was something she had accepted rather than something she was asking him to fix. The smoke had not killed anyone tonight, but it had come close enough. For the first time since reaching the mountain, the question he had been avoiding since the moment he walked into this cave settled over him with real weight. He was a man who had already failed once to keep the people he loved warm through a Montana winter. He was attempting something that no one in this valley had attempted inside a structure that Hale Patton had just told him could become a tomb if he made the wrong decision on the wrong night. He sat in the cold and asked himself whether the man who had not understood timber walls was truly capable of understanding something this old and this unforgiving. He did not have an answer. The cave gave him nothing back but darkness and the sound of his son breathing. Hale Patton came back 2 mornings after the smoke drove Beckett out of his own cave in the dark. He came alone, carrying nothing except a rawhide satchel and a length of burned pine the width of 2 fingers, scorched at one end and still faintly smelling of old char. He did not ask how bad the smoke had been. He did not offer sympathy or reassurance. He stepped through the throat wall, stood in the center of the cave with the burned pine held loosely at his side, and looked at the walls the way a man looks at a piece of ground he is trying to read before committing his weight to it. Beckett started to describe what had happened, where the smoke had gone, how fast the reversal had come. Hale held up one hand without looking at him. "Show me the ash," he said. They crouched together near the fire pit while the old man turned the burned pine slowly in his fingers and watched the faint drift of cold air moving through the chamber. He did not speak for a long time. He pointed once at the dark stain above the shale shelf, then at a section of the eastern wall where moisture had gathered in a thin film along the basalt. Then he pointed at the angle of the vent shaft opening, which Beckett had cut steeper than the sketches had shown, believing that steeper meant faster draft. He said nothing about any of it. He only pointed and then he waited. Beckett studied the cave the way Hale was studying it, not looking for what he had built, but looking at what the cave itself was trying to do with what he had built. The draft moved differently along the lower half of the chamber than it did near the ceiling. The moisture on the eastern wall was not coming from outside. It was coming from the floor, wicking upward through the stone, and the gravel bed he had laid was not thick enough to interrupt it. The heat he had generated on the previous nights had not been lost entirely through bad luck. It had been pulled downward into cold, wet ground before the stone walls ever had the chance to absorb it. The cave was not refusing to hold heat. It was bleeding heat into the earth before the earth could give it back. Beckett spent the rest of that afternoon with a short iron bar in both hands. He widened the drainage trench along the eastern floor and deepened the gravel bed by nearly 4 inches, packing the coarse stone tight enough to create a true barrier between the surface and the wet substrate beneath. Then he added a second layer of shale behind the throat wall to give the rising heat something solid to press against before it reached the vent. Finally, he lowered part of the sleeping area ceiling by lashing cedar poles between two iron spikes hammered into the basalt and stretching two deer hides across them, creating a low pocket above the bench where rising warmth would pool and hold close to where a person slept. Corey watched every step without being asked to. Near the end of the day, the boy began pressing clay into the seams between the new shale sections, smoothing it in with his thumb, the way Beckett had done 3 days earlier without ever being told. Beckett noticed but said nothing. He simply moved to the next task. Halo sat on a stone near the throat wall through most of the afternoon watching. He ate nothing, said nothing, offered no corrections. When the light outside began to fail and Beckett built the next fire, the old man stood and watched the smoke. It climbed the throat wall correctly. It pressed along the shale shelf and angled up through the vent shaft without hesitation. Hale picked up his satchel. "You found the problem yourself," he said. "That is the only kind of finding that sticks." He left before dark without another word. The fire that night burned smaller and quieter than any Beckett had attempted. He kept it low, deliberately feeding it in short intervals rather than building it high and letting it fall. By midnight, the basalt bench had absorbed enough heat that Beckett could press his palm against the stone and hold it there without discomfort. Not hot, warm, the particular steady warmth of something that had been loaded over time and intended to release slowly. At 3 in the morning, he woke and reached instinctively toward the fire pit. The flames had been dead for nearly 2 hours. The cave air still held. Corey lay on the sleeping shelf above the bench without a single blanket, pushed aside, both arms loose at his sides, breathing the long, slow breath of a boy genuinely warm rather than a boy too cold to move. Scout had left the area near the dead fire entirely. The old dog was pressed against the eastern basalt wall, and he lay there without trembling. Beckett sat in the dark for a long time after that. He looked at his hands in the faint glow of the cooling stones. He had built things with these hands before. The timber cabin where Wren had died, fence lines and feed troughs and wagon braces, and all the ordinary carpentry of frontier survival. He had always understood what those things were for and roughly how they worked, and that understanding had always been enough until the winter. It was not. What he had done in this cave was different. He had not understood it first and then built it. He had built it wrong and then listened to the failure until the failure told him where the understanding needed to go. That was not the same process. It produced something he had not expected to feel standing in a dark basalt cave in October, a sense that the knowledge he was accumulating was actually his because it had cost him something to get it. He sat with that feeling carefully, the way a man who has not eaten in a long time sits with the first real meal, not rushing it, not entirely trusting it, but no longer pretending it was not there. For the first time since Wren died, he did not look at his own hands and see only what they had failed to prevent. He saw what they were still capable of learning. 3 days after that first successful fire held through the night, Red Lindell came up the ridge. He was a young ranch hand from one of the lower valley operations somewhere in his mid-20s, lean and deliberate in his movements. The kind of man who asked questions rather than offering opinions, because asking questions was cheaper and generally more useful. He showed up carrying a burlap sack of dried venison over one shoulder in a reasonably good expression of casual indifference that he wore the way men in that valley wore most of their expressions, like a coat they had learned to put on before walking outside. He stepped through the throat wall and stopped talking almost immediately. The air inside the cave did what it always did to first-time visitors. It did not announce itself. It simply was not what they expected. Men expected a cave to feel colder once sunlight disappeared behind them. This one did not. The air sat dry and still and carried the particular warmth of a room where a fire had burned earlier, but where something other than the fire was now responsible for the temperature. Red put his hand against the basalt bench. His eyebrows moved before he could stop them. "That is not possible," he said quietly. Not loudly, not theatrically. He said it the way a man says something when he has just encountered the gap between what he understood to be true and what is plainly sitting in front of him. Beckett said nothing. Scout did not bother lifting his head from the wall where the old dog slept. Red spent nearly an hour inside that cave. He walked the full length of it twice, stopping to press his fingers along different sections of the wall. He asked short, specific questions about the gravel bed and the shale configuration above the fire pit and the angle of the vent shaft. He crouched near the throat wall and watched the way a thin line of smoke from the morning fire moved through the chamber. He was not performing interest. He was doing what men who work with physical materials do when they encounter a solution they had not considered. He was taking it apart mentally so he could understand how it had been put together. When he finally picked up his sack to leave, something had shifted in the set of his jaw. He did not name it. He said he would come back the following week and bring some split cedar from the ranch stores. He did not come back the following week. He did not come back the week after that either. Beckett understood why on the third day when he rode the lower trail to trade labor for salt and watched the Alcott Ranch feed wagons moving south through the valley road below loaded heavy and heading toward the settlement. Winter credit operated on a simple principle in isolated frontier valleys. The man who controlled your food and fuel between October and April controlled something more fundamental than your opinion about anything. It controlled your survival. And survival had a way of deciding a man's loyalties long before truth got the chance. Red Lindell had come up that ridge and put his hand on warm basalt and understood what he had found. And then he had gone back down the ridge to where his wages came from and made a different calculation. That evening, Corey sat beside the fading fire and asked softly whether Red hated them now. Beckett looked at the red coals for a long time before he answered. No, he said, winter just makes people afraid. He meant it. He was not performing patience for his son's benefit. He had made the same calculation himself many times over, many winters, and he understood the arithmetic of it. What he did not say, and what sat quietly beneath the words he did say, was that understanding why a thing happened did not always make the thing easier to hold. By the first week of November, Inez Brecken had stopped pretending the price changes were accidental. Lamp oil cost Beckett nearly twice what it had 3 weeks earlier. Salt arrived in smaller sacks than the ones he had previously purchased, and the difference in weight was not reflected in any difference in price. Whale oil disappeared from the store shelves entirely on the days he came in, which was not coincidence, and which Inez did not attempt to disguise as coincidence. She was not a subtle woman. She was a precise one. There was a difference. One afternoon, while she was balancing figures in her winter ledger, without looking up from the page, she said it plainly enough for every man in the room to hear. A boy sleeping underground all winter, she said. Territory officials hear about that sort of thing sometimes. The room went careful after that, not hostile. Careful was worse than hostile because it meant that the people in it had decided this particular situation was not worth the cost of taking a side, which meant Beckett was standing alone in it. He did not argue with her. He had learned early in life that arguing with a person who controls your access to necessary goods is a way of making yourself feel better at the direct expense of your practical situation. Instead, he looked for work. He repaired a broken wagon axle behind the blacksmith shed on a Tuesday morning and took payment in lamp oil. He spent 4 hours on a Thursday patching cracked harness leather for a cattle hauler heading east before the mountain routes closed, and took payment in dried beans and a small sack of salt at fair weight. He split firewood at 3 different homesteads over the course of a week and carried fence posts for a man whose hired hand had quit in September. He found that most men in the valley were willing to trade labor for goods as long as the exchange happened quietly and did not require them to take a visible position on anything involving Croft Alcott's former brother-in-law. Pastor Elmo Thayer saw him one evening outside the forge yard, still working an axe long after sunset. The pastor stood at the edge of the light for a moment without speaking. Blood had opened across Beckett's right palm where the handle had worn through old calluses. Beckett kept swinging. The pastor said nothing and walked on. Back at the cave that night, Beckett found Corey sitting near the bench with both boots off. The left sole had separated almost completely from the upper, held by a few threads of stitching along the toe. The boy had pushed the boots deeper under his blanket before Beckett came through the throat wall, but not quite far enough. Beckett sat down across from him and looked at the boot. He did not say anything about it. He set it between them on the stone, picked up the awl from his tool sack, and started working the sole back in the firelight. Corey watched him work without speaking. The cave around them had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate, but easy to feel. It no longer carried the provisional quality of a temporary shelter, the sense that everything inside it was arranged against the possibility of leaving rather than toward the possibility of staying. The drying line Beckett had strung between 2 iron spikes along the rear chamber held a spare shirt and Corey's second pair of wool socks. The firewood was stacked under canvas at a precise angle near the throat wall where the overhang protected it from weather. The water bucket near the bench had not frozen in 4 nights. The cave had begun to feel like the result of decisions rather than the absence of better options. He finished the boot sole and handed it back. Corey pulled it on and said nothing, which was its own kind of gratitude. Croft Alcott came up the mountain during the second week of November carrying a rifle, in the particular stillness of a man who has decided what he is going to do before he does it. He said he wanted to check on Corey. Beckett stepped aside from the throat wall and let him through without comment. Croft stopped just inside the entrance and stood there for a moment in a silence that was different from the silence of contempt. He looked at the stacked firewood under canvas. He looked at the drainage trench and the configuration of the throat wall and the vent shaft disappearing upward through black basalt above the fire pit. He did not speak. Corey was eating venison stew from a tin bowl near the bench. Scout slept against the eastern wall. Steam moved through the chamber in the slow, upward columns, rather than choking the lower air the way smoke did in overbuilt fires. Beckett lifted a small iron kettle from beside the fire pit. The water inside had developed a thin skin of ice overnight, which meant the fire had been too low for too long. He did not build the fire larger. Instead, he slid the kettle against the basalt stones lining the back of the bench, the ones that had been absorbing heat since the previous evening. Within a few minutes, the ice softened and separated into pale plates that clinked quietly against the sides of the kettle. Croft watched the process longer than he probably realized he was watching it. Beckett could tell because the man's weight shifted almost imperceptibly forward. Then Croft asked a question. How long does the stone hold after the fire goes out? It was not the question of an enemy. It was not the question of a man looking for something to use against you. It was the question of a man who was calculating something privately, turning numbers over behind his eyes, checking them against other numbers. Depends on how long you loaded it, Beckett said. 4 hours of fire, 6 hours of stone. Sometimes more. Croft said nothing else. He looked at Corey for a moment, the first real look he had given the boy since stepping inside, and something in his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cave. He turned and left without acknowledging what he had seen. But near the throat wall, just before he stepped through it, Tilda turned her head back, and her eyes found Beckett's face for the first time since the morning they had dropped the deed in the mud on the hillside. It was not a look of forgiveness. It was something earlier than forgiveness. The look of a person who has been holding a fixed position and has just discovered that the ground beneath it has quietly changed. Beckett stood in the entrance and watched the two of them move back down the ridge trail. The wind had shifted to the northwest in the past hour, and the sky above the eastern peaks had taken on the particular gray flatness that sometimes preceded serious weather in the mountains. He stood there until they were out of sight, then turned back to the fire. The canyon wind changed direction sometime after midnight that same week, not gradually and not with warning. Beckett woke to a sound inside Scout's chest, a low vibration that the dog made only when something was wrong in the dark. The old animal stood near the eastern vent with his ears flat and his nose pointed toward the ceiling of the cave, and Beckett smelled it before he was fully awake. Smoke. Wrong smoke. Heavy and wet, with the particular chemical quality of old ash being pushed backward through stone it had already passed through once. Corey started coughing from the sleeping shelf above the bench. Beckett crossed the cave in 4 steps. The smoke was pouring backward through the throat wall, invisible black rolls moving too fast and too low, filling the chamber from the floor upward. The vent shaft had frozen. Somewhere above them, packed ice had sealed the upper opening and reversed the draft entirely, and the mountain was now holding everything inside rather than drawing it out. He wrapped his scarf across his face, forced open the outer timber barrier against the wind, and stepped outside. The cold was extraordinary. Not the sharp, ordinary cold of a November mountain night, but the deeper cold of real weather moving in the kind that did not arrive gradually, but arrived already committed. Snow drove across the ridge at a near horizontal angle, less like falling weather, and more like the mountain itself moving sideways. He could not see the tree line. He could not see the lower trail. The world beyond the cave entrance was white noise and dark and nothing else. He found the vent opening by memory, rather than sight, pressing along the outer rock face, until his hands located the frame of cedar poles he had built around it in late October. Ice had packed the shaft solid. He had brought a short iron bar, and he drove it into the blockage, but the bar caught on something deeper in the shaft and would not work free. And while he was trying to angle it loose, a gust took it and sent it spinning down the slope into the dark, where he would never find it before morning. He dug with his hands, The frozen shale around the vent opening was sharp in the way that broken stone is always sharp, not cleanly edged, but jagged in random and unpredictable directions, and it opened the skin across 3 of his knuckles almost immediately. He kept digging. The wind pushed against his back hard enough to move him, and there was a section of the ridge just to his left where the ground dropped away and the footing was nothing. And he knew it was there, and he kept his weight to the right and he kept digging. Corey coughed again from below. The blockage broke apart suddenly, not gradually. One moment the shaft was sealed, and the next it was open, and the sound that came out of it was like a long-held breath, finally released a deep sucking rush as the mountain reestablished its draft and pulled the bad air back up through the column where it belonged. He felt the change through the rock under his knees before he heard it in the wind. He got back inside with his hands shaking badly enough that he could not hold the torch to check the fire. He sat down on the cave floor and pressed his palms flat against his knees and waited for the trembling to stop. Corey had pushed himself upright on the sleeping shelf and was watching him with the wide, still eyes of a child who has decided that asking questions right now would make things worse rather than better. The smoke cleared from the lower chamber in less than 10 minutes. The throat wall held. The fire had burned itself down to coals during the emergency, but the basalt bench retained enough stored warmth that the air temperature inside the cave did not fall below what it would have been with a low fire burning. Beckett built the fire back slowly and sat beside it with his arm around Corey until the boy's breathing evened out and deepened into sleep. He stayed awake the rest of that night. The next afternoon, he rode north through light snowfall to Hale's shelter and told him what had happened. The old man listened without moving. When Beckett finished, Hale looked at the floor of the shelter for a long moment, then at the cedar fire between them, which collapsed inward at that moment with a small shower of orange sparks. Then he nodded once slowly with a weight in it that had nothing to do with the technical details of what Beckett had just described. "Now you know why I understand the draft the way I do," he said. He was quiet for a while after that, long enough for the cedar fire to settle and for the wind outside to move against the rocks in a sound like dry sand pouring over wood. "Winter of '39, he said finally. "I thought I understood canyon wind better than the mountain did. Built my shelter too tight. Fire held the heat real good." His voice dropped. Not dramatically, just quietly the way a man's voice drops when what he is saying has been said before inside himself, many times in the years when there was nobody else to say it to. "But it held the smoke good too," he said, "and that is how my grandson died." The fire between them had gone to coals. Neither man moved to add wood. "Most men freeze because they lose heat," Hale said. "But that boy died because I kept the wrong things trapped inside." He did not look at Beckett while he said it. He looked at the cedar coals and then at the doorway, and his hands sat open on his knees in the posture of a man who has long since stopped fighting with something and arrived at the harder work of simply carrying it. Beckett thought about the smoke rolling toward Corey's sleeping shelf in the dark the previous night. He thought about how close the calculation had come. And then he thought about this old man climbing up a ridge in November to teach a stranger to avoid a mistake that had already cost him the worst price a person could pay for ignorance. Hale had not offered that story earlier when it might have served as a warning. He had waited until Beckett had stood at the edge of the same consequence, and then he had told it plainly without self-pity, without drama, in the same flat tone he used for everything. That was not an ordinary kind of generosity. Beckett did not have a name for what it was exactly, but he felt the weight of it, and he did not pretend otherwise. 3 days after the near disaster with the frozen vent, Hale climbed halfway up the ridge and stopped beside the outer cave wall without stepping inside. He looked at the valley below for a moment. Then he looked at the sky. "Pressure is dropping too fast," he said. Beckett looked toward the valley. At first, nothing seemed different from any other November morning in the Bitterroot Basin. Then he looked longer. No deer moving along the lower tree line. Not one. He had been watching that slope every morning for 6 weeks, and there were always deer at the lower edge of the timber in the morning hours. Today there were none, and beneath the stillness that was beginning to replace the wind, there was something else, a particular quality of silence that was different from calm. It was the silence of suspended motion, the silence of held breath. The wind had stopped entirely. Not quieted, stopped. Beckett went straight to work without speaking. He hauled additional river stones into the cave from the creek bed, adding to the thermal mass along the bench and the rear wall. He filled every container they owned with water, while the creek still ran freely enough to yield it. He reinforced the throat wall with a third timber brace, set at a different angle from the first two, to distribute load rather than concentrate it. He packed snow tightly along the outer face of the cave entrance, where canyon winds struck the exposed rock. Hardest building a crude insulating layer between the stone and the open air above the ridge. Corey understood something had changed. He moved without being told, filling gaps along the outer wall with handfuls of packed clay and small stones. He worked with the quiet, focused attention of someone who has been paying attention long enough to know what the work is for without needing it explained. Beckett watched his son pressing clay into the cracks with both thumbs and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The boy had been watching and learning and becoming capable for weeks now, and acknowledging it out loud would have diminished it somehow, the way naming a thing sometimes removes the quality that made it worth naming. As the afternoon light failed and the first thin streams of dry snow began drifting across the mountain like ash blowing from a distant fire, Beckett dragged two heavy support beams across the cave entrance and fastened them diagonally against the outer wall. He had not done this before. Corey stood in the throat wall watching, and the boy's face held the particular stillness of a child who has just understood something about the nature of what is coming that no one has explicitly told him. Outside, the mountain had gone completely silent. The kind of silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had not yet decided to announce itself. Beckett stood for a moment at the cave entrance with both hands braced against the timber frame and looked out over the Bitterroot Basin in the failing light. Below, somewhere beneath the clouds building over the eastern divide, Croft Alcott was riding the lower pasture fence line, checking cattle preparations for what he still believed was another hard but manageable Montana winter. Beckett did not know this, but he knew the kind of man Croft was, and he knew the kind of winter this was becoming. And somewhere in the gap between those two things was a set of consequences that nobody below the ridge had yet begun to calculate. He stepped back inside and let the timber barrier close behind him. The White Divide storm arrived during the night with almost no warning at all. One moment the mountain stood silent beneath low clouds, holding the particular stillness that Hale had read 3 days earlier and that Beckett had spent those 3 days preparing for. The next moment, the entire basin disappeared. Snow did not fall. It moved horizontally, driven by canyon winds that had been gathering force somewhere beyond the eastern divide for days, and it hit the upper Bitterroot slopes like a wall of white iron. The throat wall shuddered on the first real gust. Loose shale dust sifted from a crack above the fire pit and drifted down through the firelight like pale smoke. Beckett was already awake. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the storm arrived. He sat near the throat wall, fully dressed, listening to the pitch of the air, moving through the vent shaft the way a man listens to a sound in a sleeping house, alert to the difference between the sounds that belong and the sounds that do not. When the draft ran clean and strong, the shaft produced a low, steady tone, almost musical, the sound of the mountain working correctly. When ice began building in the upper column, the tone narrowed and sharpened into something thinner. A whistle at the upper edge of hearing that meant the opening was constricting, and the balance between warmth and poison was beginning to tip. He climbed out 4 times in the first 2 days to clear the shaft. Each time was harder than the last. The wind on the ridge had stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like intention-driving, packed ice into every exposed surface with a persistence that felt personal. By the second clearing, he had learned to tie himself to the outer timber brace with a length of rope before he began working because the gusts came without pattern and the drop to his left was not survivable. By the third clearing, he could not feel his fingers before he reached the vent opening, and he worked by pressure and memory rather than sensation reading. The ice by the resistance it offered, rather than by anything he could see or feel in the usual way. Corey kept the fire while Beckett was outside. Not large, small and controlled, fed in careful intervals exactly as Beckett had taught him. The boy had been doing this since the first night of the storm, without being asked to take over, simply watching when his father climbed out and then moving to the fire pit and managing it with a steadiness that had nothing childlike in it. He did not build it too high. He did not let it fall too low. When Beckett came back through the outer barrier with ice in his beard and hands too cold to close properly, there was always a consistent temperature waiting inside, always the particular dry warmth of stone that has been tended rather than driven. On the third night, the storm reached something beyond what it had been doing for 2 days. The canyon wind shifted slightly in direction, and the effect on the ridge was immediate and violent. The outer throat wall flexed visibly inward on two consecutive gusts, the timber braces holding, but creaking in a register that communicated stress rather than the strength. Loose material fell from three different ceiling cracks simultaneously. Scout pressed himself along Corey's outer side on the sleeping shelf and did not move from that position for the remainder of the night, his weight steady against the boy, blocking the cold air that slid down from the entrance in thin currents along the floor. Beckett rotated the last of the warmed river stones to positions near the sleeping shelf and added a single piece of cedar to the barn, the smallest piece that would hold a flame for the duration it needed to hold one. Nothing wasted, every decision made against the question of what would still be available tomorrow if tonight proved longer than expected. Outside, the world had ceased to exist in any form he recognized. There were no landmarks, no distances, no separation between ground and sky. There was only white movement and sound, and the sound was not the sound of wind in the ordinary sense. It was structural, the sound of pressure being applied to everything at once, the mountain absorbing it, and the cave absorbing it, and the timber framework he had spent 6 weeks building, absorbing it, and holding. Near midnight on the third night, Corey stirred briefly and looked across the cave at his father. Beckett met the boy's eyes. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the cave itself was not already saying more clearly than words could. The water in the bucket near the rear chamber had not frozen. The clothes on the drying line moved faintly in the draft, but remained dry. The bench held its warmth. The fire was small and sufficient and in control. Corey lay back down and was asleep within minutes. Beckett sat beside the throat wall through the rest of that night and listened to the storm try to find a way in. It did not find one. The storm finally loosened its grip sometime near dawn on the fourth day. The violence left before the weather did, which was how Beckett knew it was genuinely ending rather than pausing. The wind dropped from a roar to a low, persistent moan, and then to the kind of ordinary winter sound that a mountain made when it was cold but no longer angry. He sat for a long time listening to the change before he moved. When he finally stepped outside, he stopped at the entrance and stood still. The upper Bitterroot Basin had been remade overnight into something he did not entirely recognize. Drifts stood chest-high along the lower slope where the canyon winds had built them against the terrain. The pine fence line that ran along the eastern property boundary of the cave's strip of hillside had disappeared completely beneath white mounds that bore no relationship to the original geometry of the posts and wire. The wagon trail leading down toward the valley floor had become a faint suggestion in the landscape, a slight linear depression that implied a road rather than showing one. He looked down slope toward the distant shapes of the Alcott Ranch buildings, instinctively the way he had looked toward that ranch every morning for 6 weeks without quite acknowledging to himself why he was doing it. There was no smoke. Not thin smoke, not intermittent smoke. No smoke at all. The chimneys stood against the pale sky like dark marks on paper, and nothing rose from any of them. Beckett stood with the cold pressing against his face and thought about what he had noticed 3 weeks earlier, before the storm, when he had ridden the lower trail and seen the Alcott woodpile from a distance. It had been lower than it should have been for early November. Croft had been expecting the weather to follow its usual pattern, hard for a week and then manageable the way it had been for every winter the man had survived in this valley. 3 days of burial frozen chimneys, and a woodpile that was already short before any of it began. Beckett turned back toward the cave entrance. Corey was standing in the throat wall watching him. The boy had read the direction of his father's gaze, and he had read the absence of smoke in the valley below, and he had arrived at the same place without being told. He went back inside without speaking and came out again carrying the last dry pair of gloves they owned. He held them out. Beckett took them. "If Croft is alive," he said quietly, mostly to himself, "he will not have the strength left to dig out alone." He stood for another moment in the cold, not hesitating exactly, but taking the full measure of what he was about to do. Not forgiveness, not the clean resolution of a story that had been building toward reconciliation. Something simpler and harder than either of those things. The knowledge that Corey was watching and that a boy became the kind of man shaped by what he saw his father do during the winters that were genuinely difficult. He picked up the mattock from beside the entrance and started down the slope. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the Alcott Ranch through the buried valley. Several times the snow rose past his hips where the canyon winds had stacked the drifts against fence lines, and the remains of collapsed outbuildings. He used the mattock ahead of every step in those sections, testing the surface before trusting his weight to it, feeling for the hidden drop where a buried structure or a compressed drift might give way without warning. The cold was serious and steady rather than violent, now the kind that accumulated in clothing and muscle over time and made every movement slightly more expensive than the last. When the ranch house finally appeared through the blowing surface snow, what he saw confirmed what the chimneys had told him from the ridge. The front drift had built against the south wall to a height that covered the lower half of the windows. No tracks in the snow anywhere near the entrance. No evidence that anyone had been outside in the past 48 hours at minimum. He hacked through the packed drift at the door with the mattock and forced the door inward against a ridge of ice that had formed along the threshold from condensation and cold cycling through the gap at the base. Cold air moved outward, not inward. That was the first thing. The house was colder than the outside air, which meant the fire had been out long enough for the building to surrender its heat entirely to the surrounding temperature. The fire inside had not simply gone low. It had been dead for hours. A few pale coals lay beneath deep ash in the hearth, giving nothing. One of the dining chairs had been broken apart for fuel at some point during the storm, the legs and back pieces stacked beside the hearth in a row. Part of a cabinet lay in pieces near the wall. Frost had formed along the interior corners of the room, spreading outward from the floor in the particular pattern that appeared in structures that had completely lost the battle against the cold. Tilda sat near the dead hearth wrapped in 2 blankets, and a coat worn over the blankets trembling in the continuous way that bodies trembled when they had been cold for a very long time. Not the sharp shiver of sudden cold, but the deep, uncontrolled vibration of a system that had been working too hard for too many hours. The tin cup in her hands moved constantly against itself. Croft was in the chair beside her. The storm had taken something out of him that Beckett had not seen missing before. The man had always carried himself with the particular physical confidence of someone who had survived difficult things and expected to continue surviving them. But that quality was gone, now burned through by 3 days of fighting a losing situation with diminishing resources. His beard had frost in it from his own breath, freezing against it through the night. He looked at Beckett the way a man looked at something he had not expected to see, which in this case was someone who still had strength left in him. Then his eyes moved to the dry wool coat on Beckett's shoulders, the clear eyes, the steadiness in the way Beckett was standing. The cave held, Croft said. It was not a question. Beckett nodded once. Tilda turned her face into both hands when she heard it. Croft looked at the dead fire for a long moment. Then he began slowly the work of getting himself out of the chair. He was not fast about it, and it was not easy to watch, but Beckett did not move to help, and Croft did not ask for help, and eventually the man was standing. "I am not taking charity," Croft said. Beckett looked at him across the cold room. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a man who has been proven right, just with the honest exhaustion of someone who had been doing a hard thing for a long time and was still doing it. "Wren would not forgive either one of us," he said, "if Corey had to bury more family after this winter." The room was silent except for the wind pressing against the outer wall with its reduced but still serious force. Tilda had lowered the cup from her face. She was looking at Croft. Croft was looking at the dead hearth. Then he reached for his coat where it hung beside the door, and the decision was made without another word spoken about it. The climb back to the cave nearly finished what little Croft and Tilda had left. The drifts on the upper trail were deeper than what Beckett had come through in the valley, shaped by the way the canyon winds had moved differently at higher elevation, and in 2 places the snow was nearly shoulder height on Tilda, who was shorter than either of the men. Beckett broke the trail ahead with the mattock. Corey had come partway down the slope to meet them and stayed behind Tilda without being asked, one hand near her elbow whenever the footing shifted. Scout moved around all 4 of them in wide, slow circles through the white, finding the solid ground by instinct and moving across it without hesitation, the old animal navigating by something that had nothing to do with sight. When they finally reached the cave entrance and Beckett pulled the outer barrier aside, the warm air reached Croft and Tilda before they were fully through the opening. Croft stopped just inside the throat wall. He stood there without speaking for a long moment. Beckett did not explain anything. There was no need for explanation. The cave explained itself to everyone who entered it honestly, which was most people, once the cold had stripped away whatever position they had arrived with. The water bucket near the rear chamber had not frozen. The clothes on the drying line were dry, Corey's coat hung against the eastern wall where the stone still held residual warmth from the previous evening. Near the bench, Scout found his position against the basalt and settled without urgency. Beckett gave Tilda a bowl of broth and added one piece of cedar to the fire. No declaration, no performance. The economy of the gesture said everything that needed saying about how the cave had survived and how the ranch house had not. Croft looked at the low-ceiling pocket above the sleeping shelf, the place where Beckett had hung deer hides on cedar poles to hold warmth close to where a person slept. He looked at the gravel bed along the floor and the configuration of the throat wall. He looked at the drying line and the unfrozen water and the small controlled fire in the stone that was warm hours after any fire had contributed to it. Then he walked to the basalt bench and placed one rough hand flat against the stone. Warm, still warm. He held his hand there for a long time. His eyes were not moving across the cave anymore. They had stopped. He was looking at something Beckett could not see, something interior, and his face had the expression of a man recalculating something fundamental, working through the arithmetic of a long-held position, and finding that the numbers had come out differently than he had always believed they would. Beckett thought about Wren saying that the house stayed cold from the floor upward, thought about the specific failure that had cost her life, which was not lack of effort or lack of love, but lack of understanding. Croft had blamed Beckett for that failure for 2 years, with the ferocity of a man who needed the blame to be somewhere particular so that the grief had a direction. And Beckett had accepted that blame in part because he had not fully disagreed with it. But what Croft was touching right now was the evidence of a different kind of man than the one he had condemned on the hillside in October. Not a man who had always known what he was doing, a man who had not known and had been willing to be wrong repeatedly in front of a cold mountain until the mountain showed him what right looked like. That was not the same failure that had cost Wren her life. It was something closer to its opposite. Croft pulled his hand back from the stone. He did not speak immediately. Tilda had stopped trembling. Corey sat near the fire and watched the adults with the patient silence of a child who understood that something important was completing itself and that his role in it was to wait without interrupting. "What you built here," Croft said finally. His voice was different from any voice Beckett had heard from him before. Not softer exactly. Emptied of something. The contempt that had been its most consistent quality for 2 years was simply gone, and without it the voice sounded older and more tired and more honest. "What you built here is better than anything I have on that ranch." It was not an apology. It was not a reconciliation in any formal sense. It was a man telling the truth about a thing he had previously refused to look at directly, which in the language of men who had spent their lives in hard physical work and isolated country was as close to those other things as most of them ever managed. Beckett nodded once. That was the end of what needed to be said between them. Everything else would be conducted in the currency of action over the years that followed, which was the only currency either man had ever fully trusted. The road crews did not fully clear the lower valley trails until nearly 2 weeks after the White Divide storm finally released its hold on the upper Bitterroot Basin. By the time they did, the story had already moved faster than the snow. Men arriving at Bitterroot Crossing no longer spoke about Beckett Pruitt with amusement. They spoke about him the way people spoke about something they had misjudged badly enough that the misjudgment itself had become a kind of information, a thing worth examining rather than dismissing. Red Lindell came to the cave first. He came carrying split cedar on a hand sled, and he stopped outside the throat wall for a moment, uncertain his posture carrying the particular discomfort of a man who has done something he cannot undo and is not sure whether the damage is repairable. Beckett stepped aside from the entrance without comment. Red came through and did not say anything about the weeks he had not come back, and Beckett did not raise it. And both of them understood that the silence on the subject was not indifference but practical forgiveness, the kind that did not require discussion to be genuine. Pastor Elmo Thayer arrived 2 days later with flour and dried beans and lamp oil packed under oilcloth. He asked no questions about the cave's construction or Beckett's methods. He sat near the fire for an hour and drank a cup of coffee and spoke about the storm's damage in the valley below with the careful neutrality of a man who had watched the whole winter from a position of deliberate non-involvement and was now present in a way that was its own kind of statement. 2 ranch hands followed over the next several days carrying iron brackets for the vent shaft supports after they had heard from someone who heard from someone else how close the upper opening had come to freezing shut for good during the storm. They worked efficiently and without ceremony and left without asking to be thanked. Then Inez Brecken climbed the ridge. She came on a Thursday morning in the week after the trails cleared, wearing her heaviest coat and carrying a cloth bag that clinked quietly with each step. She did not announce herself before arriving. She simply appeared at the throat wall and waited for Beckett to acknowledge her, which he did by standing aside. She walked through the cave more slowly than the others had. She was not performing a tour. She was doing what she did in her store with accounts that did not add up the way she expected, going through the ledger line by line until she found where her calculation had gone wrong. Her eyes moved from the unfrozen water bucket to the dry clothes on the drying line, from the small fire-producing warmth far beyond its size to the rear chamber where nothing had frozen and nothing had burned. She lifted the corner of a dry wool blanket hanging near the bench and rubbed the fabric between her fingers, checking for the brittleness that cold left in cloth. It was not there. She set the blanket back without comment. Then she turned and faced Beckett directly, which was something she had not done in the general store all winter. "I sold you lamp oil at the wrong price," she said, "more than once." She paused. "Spring comes, you come to the store and you pay what my other customers pay, not what I charged you." The words came out measured and deliberate, the way Inez Brecken did everything, but the effort behind them was visible to anyone who knew her. She was not a woman who admitted error. She was a woman who had built her reliability in the valley on the consistency of her judgments, and adjusting one of those judgments publicly in the cave of the man she had most publicly doubted was not a small thing for her to do. Beckett looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. Inez set the cloth bag down near the entrance. It held 6 candles and a tin of rendered fat for waterproofing leather, which was a practical gift from a practical woman, and also her way of closing the account in a manner that did not require her to say anything further about it. She left without looking back, which was also her way. Outside, Croft Alcott had come up the ridge with 3 other men, and they were working without instruction, stacking additional split wood against the outer wall under a canvas overhang they had brought with them. Nobody asked them to do it, and nobody coordinated it. They had simply decided it needed doing and come up to do it. At one point, Croft paused in the work and looked at the men around him. "Beckett Pruitt kept us alive in the very place this valley laughed at," he said. Nobody argued with him. Nobody smiled either. The silence after he said it carried the particular weight of a truth that a room full of people recognize simultaneously and have no comfortable way to respond to, so they respond by being quiet and continuing with what they are doing. Near the rear chamber, Red was stacking fresh cedar alongside the bench without asking permission before he did it. Beckett watched him for a moment from across the cave. That single, unremarkable act said more than anything Red could have spoken. You did not stack wood in a man's shelter without asking, unless you considered yourself someone who belonged there, and that belonging was not something Beckett could grant him through words or gestures. Red had granted it to himself by coming back, by working, by being present in the way that mattered. The valley had changed, not completely and not without remainder, but in the ways that counted, it had changed. Hale Patton died during the first thaw of spring, not from the cold and not from the storm. He died on a morning when the meltwater was already running in thin, cold streams beneath the eastern rocks above the basin, when the worst of it was genuinely over, when the season had turned enough that a man could believe the hardest part was behind him. His heart simply stopped the way old hearts stop, sometimes without particular drama and without warning in the middle of an ordinary morning. Beckett found him in his chair with the charcoal sketches spread across the work table in front of him, as though he had fallen asleep in the middle of thinking through a problem. The burn pine he used for testing draft flow lay across the corner of one sketch. The cedar fire in his shelter had gone to cold ash some hours earlier. Beckett stood in the doorway for a time before entering. He thought about the grandson who had died in the winter of '39. He thought about the decades between that death and this one, all the mornings Hale had woken up carrying that particular knowledge and chosen to do something with it rather than simply carry it alone. He thought about the old man climbing a ridge in November to teach a stranger how to avoid a mistake that had already taken the heaviest payment from him. There was no word Beckett knew for that kind of generosity. It did not fit inside ordinary categories. It was something a man did not plan or perform, but simply expressed the way certain qualities express themselves in action because they had nowhere else to go. They buried Hale on a high basalt slope that faced the sunrise, not far from the vent ridges he had studied over the years when weather was building in the mountains. The grave was simple, a stone marker and a cedar crossbeam and no long sermon. Pastor Thayer spoke a few words. The wind carried most of them away before they finished traveling the distance between his mouth and the ears of the men standing there. Corey set a small piece of basalt on the grave marker before they left. He did not explain the gesture, and no one asked. Beckett recognized the stone as one Corey had carried in his coat pocket since October, the first river stone he had brought up from the creek bed in those first days of building. He had been carrying it all winter without ever mentioning it. The years that followed, the White Divide winter settled into a particular pattern in the upper Bitterroot Basin that no one had predicted at the beginning of it. The cave remained. That was where everything else started. It remained first for Beckett and Corey through the winters that followed, and then in a different way for the valley. Because word traveled the way word traveled in isolated mountain communities thoroughly and slowly, and eventually everyone who spent serious time in the high country above the basin knew where the eastern shelter was and roughly what it could do. A trapper caught in a whiteout 2 winters after the big storm came through the throat wall, half frozen and was warm enough to continue his route 2 days later. A freight crew whose lead driver had made a navigation error in deteriorating weather spent 3 days inside the cave eating Beckett's dried provisions, and left 4 days' worth of cedar behind them when the weather cleared. Ranch hands knew the location by landmark and could find it in conditions that made the lower trails impassable. By the end of the decade, the people of the upper Bitterroot Basin had stopped calling it Beckett's Cave. They called it the Storm Shelter, which was a name that belonged to all of them rather than to any one man, and which was in that way more accurate than the original name had been. Corey Pruitt grew into a man who built things in stone. He had his father's hands and Hale Patton's patience and a technical understanding of thermal mass and airflow that he had acquired not from any formal instruction, but from years of watching and doing and correcting his own mistakes. He taught what he knew to men who asked and some who did not ask until the need arose, and he used almost the exact words Hale had used, which was not imitation but inheritance. The natural transmission of hard knowledge from the person who had paid for it to the people who would one day need it. Croft Alcott became a regular visitor to the cave in the years after the storm. He came most Sundays after church services in Bitterroot Crossing, walking the ridge trail in better weather, and finding other routes when the trail was impassable. He never arrived empty-handed. Rope, beeswax for waterproofing the vent shaft housing, replacement tool heads wrapped in cloth, once a new iron pry bar to replace the one Beckett had lost off the ridge in the November blizzard, the loss mentioned once and never again. He never offered an explicit apology for what had happened in October of '61, for the deed dropped in the mud, for the years of contempt before that, for the specific weight of blame he had placed on a man who was already carrying enough of his own. He was not built for that kind of language, and both men understood it. What he was built for was showing up on Sunday mornings with useful things and staying long enough to be present. That was the form his accounting took, and it continued for the rest of his life. One evening, late in autumn, many years after the winter that had changed the shape of things in the upper Bitterroot Basin, Beckett sat outside the cave entrance as the light failed over the valley below. The cold was coming on again, the way it always came on in that country, without apology and without delay, but it no longer held the quality of threat that it had once held. It was simply weather now, something to be understood and prepared for rather than feared. Inside the cave, Corey was explaining airflow to a young boy from one of the valley homesteads below the son of a man who had been a small child during the White Divide storm and who had grown up hearing about the eastern shelter the way children grew up hearing about things that had happened before they could remember them into fact rather than story. "The mountain breathes if you let it," Corey said. Beckett heard the words from outside and recognized them. He had heard them first from Hale Patton in that low stone shelter north of the basin, spoken in the same flat, certain voice, containing the same weight of knowledge that had been purchased at a price neither man had chosen to pay, but both had found a way to make mean something. He looked out over the Bitterroot Basin as the last light left the western sky, and the stars began to appear above the eastern peaks, cold and very clear, the way stars appeared in mountain country in the weeks before the deep winter settled in for good. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The cave behind him was warm and in use, and had been for years, and the boy inside it was learning something that would keep him and others alive through winters that had not yet arrived. The knowledge was passing from Hale to Beckett, to Corey, to this boy from the valley, whose name Beckett did not yet know. Moving forward the way all genuine knowledge moved. From the person who had paid for it toward the people who would one day need it, carrying with it the accumulated weight of every mistake and correction and cold night and careful fire that had produced it. In those mountains, people eventually learned that the things they had called useless were often simply waiting for the right hands to understand them.